and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our talk today, our lunch talk. I'm Noelani DeBeta, EU Policy Coordinator at Climate Alliance, and I'm your host today. I'm really excited to warmly welcome you to our third lunch talk of the ENPOR project. Many of you may have already known about the ENPOR project. It's a Horizon 2020 project, and it's to tackle energy poverty in the private rental sector. And they've been working together with 10 policies from different member states to support and learn from each other. Today, we are discussing how the EU's Fit for 55 package of legislative proposals could trigger renovations in the private rental sector, what the impacts are for municipalities and energy poor citizens, and especially specifically minimum energy performance standards for buildings. We'll explore whether these standards, or MEPS as they're called, MEPS, could be a tool for municipalities to ride on the renovation wave while protecting energy vulnerable peoples and groups. So just a note that we're going to be recording today's talk and publishing this talk later on the website. And so by joining us today, you agree to our data protection policies. And in case you still wish not to be seen, now would be the time for you to please turn off your camera. So, I mean, the price of energy is increasing at a crazy rate. Everybody's feeling this now. It's shooting through the roof, no pun intended. And we've got millions of homes that are energy inefficient. So it costs more than it really should or ought to heat or cool our homes. Also, there's unnecessary and extraneous carbon emissions that are being released into the atmosphere due to the additional wasteful energy that we're using, which emits more carbon. And then on top of it all, there's decreasing household income. So as people are struggling due to the myriad economic challenges of our times, especially that which has been caused or connected to the pandemic, you know, folks, basically inflation is on the rise and our purchasing power is decreasing. So what does this mean for social justice? And is energy efficiency in the building stock, does this have something that holds some powerful answers for us to try to help deal with all these multiple challenges at the same time? How do we address inefficient housing? Where's the money for all this going to come from? And to address all of this, and how do we reduce people's energy bills? So in the race to net zero emissions or climate neutrality, housing, deep renovation, and energy efficiency all play an important role. Research and expertise and experience also shows that energy efficient housing not only alleviates energy poverty, it also contributes to the reduction of CO2 emissions. So those who struggle to meet their energy needs often live in inefficiently or insufficiently insulated dwellings rather, with low energy efficiency. And in the special case of private rental housing, renovating these homes requires overcoming several additional problems. One of the main policy tools that the European Commission is using to motivate energy efficient housing is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which is currently under reconstruction. So the recently leaked proposal introduces minimum energy performance standards, as I mentioned, for existing buildings that are undergoing major renovation works as part of a renewed push to achieve a net zero emissions in the building stock by 2050. However, experts are also fearing that these minimum energy performance standards could make renovation unaffordable for many homeowners who are already struggling to make ends meet, and may increase the problems of energy poor tenants as well as increase the tenant-landlord dilemma. So where does that leave us? Well, everyone, I'd like you to just grab your sandwiches for joining us today for your lunch meetings. And if you're wearing your pajamas today because you're at home, that's not a problem. Basically, what we're going to do here is we're going to try to cram in all that we can in the next 35, 40 minutes or so and try to untangle this mess of systemic issues to see how minimum energy performance standards can address energy poverty. So we have a wonderful lineup of speakers today. Our guests have a wide range of perspectives on the proposed EU policies, as well as some municipal hands-on, municipal level hands-on experience for what is required to actually implement those renovations that are needed and address some of the associated challenges today. Our speakers are Louise Sunderland from the Regulatory Assistance Project, Hélène Sibileau, the Building Performance Institute of Europe. We have Emmanuelle Causse from the International Union of Property Owners, Yuri Sumeghy, who's from Habitat for Humanity International, and Ina Karova of the energy agency Plovdiv. They're here to discuss what are the implications of minimum energy performance standards on national policy level and on local practice level, and what that can mean for the EU's recast of the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive. So without further ado, because tackling Europe's inefficient building stock isn't just about reaching Europe's climate targets, it's also essential to tackling social inequality. And I'd like to turn to our first speaker, Louise Sunderland from the Regulatory Assistance Project. So Louise, if you would just unmute yourself, could you maybe let our audience know what exactly are these minimum energy performance standards and what do they have to do with energy poverty?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you've already outlined that I think we will all be talking about MEPS next week when the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive recast proposal is published on Tuesday. MEPS are considered to be the kind of central new exciting piece of the EPBD. So good question, what are they? MEPS are simply regulations that require selected buildings to meet a performance standard at a chosen date in the future or a point in their building life cycle. So perhaps when they're sold, when they're rented out, they undergo a change of contract, they're renovated, for example. And we are introducing these in the EPBD as a new measure at a European level. That isn't to say that they're a completely untried measure. There are a number of places around the world that are introducing these standards. I think very much in response to the real need to move quickly now on the building sector. We would all admit that us that work in the building sector, we haven't done enough, we haven't been successful enough. And so I think there is this need for kind of new measures. So as I've said, there's sort of lots of different examples of these across the world, and they all look a little bit different. So there's lots of different ways to design these forms of regulation. But what they all commonly identify is the target buildings, the metric to be used to define the standard. And in Europe, that I think we will expect next year next week to see being the energy performance certificate that we have in every country. And then we define the date or the trigger point. And beyond those kind of three building blocks for the regulation, there's lots of different ways to design them. So we have very simple regulations that can be more or less ambitious. So for example, in the Netherlands, there's a standard for offices that they must meet EPC-C by 2023. And EPC-C is clearly, a relatively more ambitious standard, more ambitious, for example, than the one in the UK, which only requires rented buildings to meet an EPC-E. So you can see this sort of single standard, you can go for a high ambition or low ambition. Other standards include a kind of progressive phased approach to moving buildings through the EPC brackets over periods of years. And the other really exciting model that we've seen coming out of the French Citizens Climate Convention is a deep renovation standard, which says when you address the worst performing buildings first, you have to renovate them all the way up to a very, very high decarbonised standard. And therefore you touch those buildings once. Just to quickly finish on what does this mean for energy poverty? Why are we interested? Quite clearly, you've already said that, poor housing, inefficient housing is, we know, one of the major structural reasons that causes for energy poverty, and the worst performing buildings have missed renovation to date. They have been missed out with all our efforts. So what these regulations do is direct and sort of almost guarantee the renovations of these worst performing buildings. By nature, they start with the worst performing buildings. So that is very important when we know low income households live disproportionately in the worst performing buildings. And also for the private rented sector, we do also see where these regulations have been used for the housing sector. They have been used more in the private rented sector than they've been used in the owner-occupier sector. So lots of jurisdictions are seeing the potential of these regulations really to sort of, in some ways, overcome the landlord-tenant split incentive and provide an incentive to landlords to renovate and that clear path for landlords to renovate. So I'll stop there, but that's the kind of the 101 of what MEPS are, and what we will receive next week in the EPBD, is yet to be seen.
Thank you so much, Louise. That gives a good overview and a context of and situates our talk for today. Thank you. We're just going to pepper off these questions to all of our speakers because we want to go through a couple rounds, ladies and gentlemen, and give everyone a chance to add to the discussion. So I will move right on now to Hélène, if you want to undo your microphone. So Hélène, could you let the audience know, what would you say is the best design for developing minimum energy performance standards? What are the quality principles for a good minimum energy performance standard framework if policymakers are to actually tackle some of these issues around energy poverty?
Thanks, Noelani, for the question. I think as an overall statement, I would say that the best design for MEPs to work is one that tackles simultaneously our climate and our social challenges in the building sector. If we design a MEPs framework that brings us halfway or even not that far, it means lost benefits and opportunities for those households, not lifting them out completely of energy poverty and not bringing us on a pathway to reaching our climate targets for both 2030 and 2050. So MEPs really are there to serve as a trigger for renovations that would not happen otherwise, and to boost both the rate and the depth of renovation. As quality principles, actually, concretely, I would mention 5. The first one is that we have to ensure the right buildings are targeted. We often say MEPs should target the worst performing buildings. What do we mean exactly? If we say the worst performing buildings are only the, let's say, 10% or 15% worst performing buildings of the stock, that's not enough. I don't think we can say only G buildings are the worst performing. I think you can also include in that F label or D or E label buildings into that. So what we're saying is that at least 25% of the bottom range of the stock in terms of performance can be labeled as worst performing buildings and unfit for housing. The second quality principle is ensuring that we target the right occupants. And we know energy poverty has many different phases throughout Europe. It can be social housing, it can be tenants, but it can be also owners, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. The third quality principle is we need to ensure MEPs are done at the right moment. Louise spoke about different ways of designing MEPs, and I think we need both having compliance dates and a long-term vision from 2030 to 2050, but we also need to make good use of trigger points in the natural life of a building. The fourth quality principle is to ensure that the right renovation is done. And when I say right renovation, I mean the level of ambition. I think the long-term trajectory of MEPs should be aligned with deep renovation ambition. And those, let's say, 25% worst performing buildings, they should be at least brought to the average level of the stock, but also in the long term deeply renovated. And then my fifth and last quality principle I want to mention, which is also very important, is ensuring that the right framework is in place and embedded together with the regulatory framework. So we can speak about the MEPs framework as regulation, financing, and technical assistance. And just as a piece of information, 1/3 actually of the stakeholders that replied to the EPPD public consultation back in June said that financial support is an essential element of a successful MEPs framework. And I think we can maybe talk about a bit more in details later, but I think it's also crucial to embed the regulations with technical assistance and financing together.
Hélène, thank you so much for that. Yes, these principles all make good sense and they're common sense or logic. I mean, why would you want to only make the minimum standard G? And you need higher levels as well to be captured, so you get that 25%. And of course, Europe needs a lot more ambition if we're going to reach our climate targets as well. Hélène also has some resources, ladies and gentlemen, which are going to be shared both in the chat and later on the website. So if you want to find out more, do check out the website and the pieces that will be posted shortly. Thank you, Hélène. So we will move on now to Emmanuelle, and Emmanuelle is going to just take a step back and help us to understand some of these challenges in the private rental sector. So Emmanuelle, could you let the audience know like what you see as the main challenges are for the introduction of these minimum energy performance standards, please? Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Louise and Hélène. I think it's you said a lot of things already, so I will try to be short. For us, obviously, the MEPs will be the most impactful and the most radical type of measure of most impactful measure of the EPBD. There are different ways to tackle energy poverty. There are different ways to push for innovation, but this is certainly, as I say, the most radical ones. The challenges, I wouldn't like to focus only on the challenges during the discussion, but if I speak now only about the challenges, I would say it's a daunting task. It's a huge task. If we only talk about the worst performing stock, as you say, 50 to 20% of the stock, it's already quite substantial. It's all depend on the pace, on the sector you will target, and on the targets you will put in place. So indeed, the rating will be important here, and we don't know what the EPC G would be in 5 years time from now, because the EPC are changing as well. This is also very much depend on the state of a national stock. Obviously, there are better performing stocks where this task will be easier in countries where the part of the stock that is badly performing is bigger, and most of the time this country are of course the poorest country in Europe, so this shouldn't be forgotten, and this is not only valid at national level but also at regional and local level. On top of that, of course, there are different capacity in different branches of the sector also to respond quickly to the situation. If you talk about one single real estate owner, one single social housing owner, it will be able to respond more faster to the situation or to the obligation than, let's say, a landlord that is in a multi-apartment building and has to take the decision with 500 other co-owners. And we know, for example, that in multi-apartment building, the decision to renovate until the end of a renovation takes on average 4 to 6 years at the very best. So that's quite a substantial element when it comes to cut-off dates. Again, as well, it all depends on the capacity of the construction sector. We have shortage of workers in some countries already. So of course, this is a business opportunity for the sector, but it will also impact on the timeline and on the capacity of the sector to face the situation. We shouldn't come up and end up with a situation when you have a bottleneck, but waiting list for professional is a few years, and that of course has an impact on the cost of renovation. That's also something very important. On top of that, of course, the cost of renovation is important for us. The cost of renovation is all very much depend on the scale of a renovation, on the type of buildings, on the location, etc. So I will not go into that level of detail, but even 6,000 to 8,000 euro investment for a private individual is quite substantial. And what you shouldn't forget is that lots of private rented buildings in Europe are in the hands of private individuals. We don't have statistics for all countries, but I will give you an example. In Germany, which is a bigger rental market in Europe, it's 80% of the stock. So this is quite something you need to keep in mind when you look at this type of measures. Of course, as well, the cost very much depends on the value of a property. If you have a property that is value 90,000 euro, if you have to do 10,000 euro investment, is more than 10% of the value. While if you are in a place like London or Paris, where the value of your property is 1 million euro, 10,000 euro investment is not much. And of course, as well, the poorest owners, the poorest co-owners, the poorest landlord, and the poorest tenants tend to live or own the worst performing stock, and this is something we shouldn't forget as well. So altogether, the challenges is really are unlikely to be universal across the board, but and the impact cannot also be evaluated in isolation, because we need to think about the other measure of the Fit for 55 package that will also impact the sector, and also all kind of national, local, and regional legislation that also play a role when it comes to this type of measure. From rental law to taxation law and to planning permission, etc. So what we often say is that MEPs can fall short of a social objective if, as Hélène and both Louise said, if they are not accompanied by the right measure, by the right incentive, by the right technical assistance, and for us, even more importantly, if they are not progressive. So really the dates, the pace will be crucial. And we need to make sure that we get everyone on board before we impose something that is unachievable. And I might come back to that later on during the discussion.
Oh, yes, please do. Thank you for that, Emmanuelle. You packed in a lot of challenges. It looks like we have our work cut out for ourselves. And as you said, there's a real difference in the context depending on the country where these renovations are being conducted. So that ties in nicely. Our next speaker, Gyorgy Sumeghy of Habitat for Humanity International. If you would like to join us then. So how do you see the chance for implementing these minimum energy performance standards in, let's say, Central European, Eastern European countries? And what do you think is needed to make them actually tackle some energy poverty issues as well?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. Habitat for Humanity is implementing the Horizon-funded COMAC project, which is a sister project of ENPOR. And our focus, and also in this project, is to support owner-occupied multi-apartment buildings. I think Emmanuelle already referred to this, and also Hélène. I think that this is a special challenge in Central and Eastern Europe because of historic reasons. Basically, these countries lack the social housing stock, and we have very high ownership rates, and we are talking about the society of poor homeowners in many of these countries. And that's why in any discussions, especially when it comes to EU policies and the EPBD, we always try to make the claim that some of the people who are owner-occupiers in multi-apartment buildings should be given the same social attention as people who live in social housing in Western Europe. And to some extent, this is the case also in Southern Europe, in Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, for different reasons, but we have these multi-apartment owner-occupied buildings. I think the main challenge here is, as it was referred by Emmanuelle and Hélène, how to make the community of homeowners to make a decision. And we see it as the key bottleneck, not the financing, not the construction, not even the subsidies. But first, if you cannot convince the community to have a majority vote regulated by the country's legislation, then no renovation will happen. And that's why our main ask for the EPBD was that member states should provide complex technical assistance to help the homeowner associations. And it's not just planning the project, running a tender for a construction company, but also this, what we call social mobilization or social facilitation, which helps the community come together and facilitate the decision making. With this regard, when it comes to the maps, our main thinking is that the maps can incentivize renovation for good in this sector, in the owner-occupied multi-apartment buildings. I checked with our engineer in North Macedonia what kind of price impact can have the maps, and he gave me a calculation that if we are targeting C, which is quite ambitious already, there is not a significant price difference from a basic energy efficiency renovation or going for C, because as he explained to me, in a big building, you have some fixed costs like the scaffolding, the workforce, and really the changing element is how thick is the insulation. And whether you use a 6 centimeter insulation or 10, which we would need probably for C, the difference is quite minimal when it comes to monthly payments of loans. For one household, the difference between a basic renovation and achieving C would be €2 per month. We are talking about paying a loan for a couple of years, but it's not. So our main concern is to convince the homeowners to go for renovation, and we are not that worried about whether reaching level C would put an extra burden on that. And in the second round, I would propose some concrete measures for subsidy and for loans. Thank you.
Thank you, Gyorgy. That's very fascinating. I didn't realize it could be that potentially affordable to just go from one level to the next. But as you raise the point, yes, there's not just those that are energy poor, but there can be, poor homeowners who may. It sounds like it's about public acceptance too, and a sense of social protection and feeling that you can trust your government and the loan, and that your home will be worth something better later, and multiple different issues coming in there. So thank you so much. And yes, we will have time for our next round to address go in a little deeper with all of our opening round here. My next speaker here is Ina Karova, and Ina comes from the Energy Agency of Plovdiv. So Ina, could you tell us from the perspective of maybe more the local authorities and the energy agencies that are implementing energy efficient building upgrades and with the related certification schemes, what do you think are the challenges of using these minimum energy performance standards?
So the energy agencies have been both in the clean energy transition wave and the renovation wave, and some of us have coordinated a lot of activities and actions related to renovation processes in residential and public buildings. So we have this overview of the process and the challenges to the MEPs. Well, in first place, the greatest challenge probably is comprehensive and integrated deep renovation of the buildings. We need to guarantee that there are no interventions that go below the standards, basically just the opposite. We need to aim for interventions that are ambitious, that go after ambitious targets. This will be a trigger for the green energy transition as well. And there is a big challenge related to the data that we need for following up different interventions. Basically, we don't have sound basis for comparing before and after different interventions, and there is no secure way to guarantee that a really deep renovation has been implemented. One way to do that is the energy performance certification, but it is usually based on calculations and not on real live data. One solution to this could be the establishment of the one-stop shops as comprehensive services for all stakeholders across the renovation chain, so that we can orchestrate all the efforts for renovating one building, the homeowners, the vulnerable households, the companies that provide energy services, and so on. The energy agencies are the kind of bodies that can run such one-stop shops, and even now we have a few of them running such services across Europe. Because we have the technical knowledge, the financial knowledge, we can play the psychological role of mediators between the users and the providers, and so on. Another thing is facilitating the finance. Finance is never enough. I mean, that's for sure. We would advocate that the finance goes hand in hand with ambitious targets. And I would give Bulgaria is probably a bad example, that here the renovation wave and its finance usually aim for level C of building performance, which is rather low. We'd like this thing to change, for example, and we would advocate for high ambition and for better finance when you aim higher, basically. We also need a clear mechanism to fund vulnerable households. I'm not sure if anywhere in Europe there is such strict mechanism that says which households can consider vulnerable and how much money they can get for the renovation. And finally, I guess we need to activate the citizens. Usually we go chasing after them, talking about renovation and how this process needs to happen with their buildings and apartments. And probably we need to turn the things a bit and get them interested into the nuts and bolts of the renovation process, how it goes, what the impacts could be, what the benefits could be for the residents. So activating the citizens can be a game changer when it comes to the maps and their implementation.
That's great. Thank you. So the one-stop shops are a place where the public can come and get everything they need, some information, understand what it's going to cost, figure out who's who in this area without having to be completely lost and confused on how to begin. And also, I guess that then helps, sort of motivate citizens when they have that sort of accessibility. I actually heard about a project recently where they were taking one-stop shops that were mobile and going city to city and just sort of popping up and then sending a flyer to people's homes so that they knew they were there, because people may not even know a one-stop shop is just down the street. So it was an interesting project where they're finding out that, oh, there's the one-stop shop caravan is passing through our town, and they're explaining how we do this. And they've seen an increase 15% instead of like the 1.5 whenever they come to town. So this is very helpful. And then of course the finance to match those ambitious interventions, as you say, which and to aim for higher standard than C. C sounds sort of in the middle, but yeah, we want to go as high as we can, right? So thank you for that. And it looks like, ladies and gentlemen, we do have time for round 2 here. So we're going to just speedily go right on. Thanks. I see questions coming up. Maybe some of our speakers are picking up on those and can add them into their discussions. But I'm going to now turn back to Emmanuelle. And Emmanuelle, if you wouldn't mind, so these minimum energy performance standards, which I'm going to call MEPs from now on, I think the audience has heard the word enough. They're already part of the national legislation in France, I've learned. So what are your experiences of MEPs impacting this sort of tenant and landlord dilemma in France, and concerning also energy poverty?
Thank you for the question. One of the issues with MEPs, in my view, is that we don't have enough experience yet. Actually, France is maybe not the best example because the MEPs measure have just been adopted, or they're in place for a while, but they will be entering into, let's say, the first cut-off date will come in 2023 for some of them, without entering to details, and 2025 mainly. So, and I think we discussed as well the UK many times, for example, with Louise, and we saw there is not yet, as far as I know, very full comprehensive study on the full impact of the MEP. So that's something that's missing. I understand that is something that is underway, but it's not there yet. But if I look at the French example, what is interesting to see is to see the reaction of the private rentals sector. What we saw a couple of weeks ago, there was a study from Sumeghy, which is one of the main online platforms to sell and rent properties in France. And they came up with statistics showing that this year compared to last year, so the same period, until October, I think, they show that there was a considerable increase of what they call passoire énergétique, so worst performing building on the market. So people are trying to get rid of these properties. This is the case, I think, almost 30 cities out of 40 they studied and they assess. And out of these 40, I think this increase is quite considerable in 23 of them. So that's quite a trend. We will see how this evolves in the coming years. And we also don't know which type of buildings are a rental building going into on the market, or are they privately occupied building? But still, we see this trend. And I was reading actually today, that's quite a coincidence, there is another study done by PAP, which is also a very big online platform for the same purpose in France. And they had been surveyed last month about, I think, over 6,000 landlords. So it's quite a substantial number. And they came up to the conclusion that over 50% of them agree that we need to eradicate worst performing stock. But they are quite put off by the challenges, let's say, and 1/3 of its owners are considering selling their property, so their rental property. So one of the impacts of MEPs, of course, and it's also something that we have to better assess. Here again, I'm not drawing conclusion. I'm just saying this is something that could eventually happen. Is one of the things is also that this might have an impact on the scale of the availability of rental property on the market. So again, this is to be taken with caution. This, of course, not real statistic, and it's not a full assessment of the sector, but still, it shows already that there is some concern among the private rental sector, let's say.
And so, do you think that that people are just not interested in having to go through the whole hurdle of renovating an older building that they might own? They'd rather just, and so there's this push to sell them, and people want sort of a more ready-made, more energy efficient home? Or what is the purpose, or what is the reason that you think there's this, everyone's trying to get rid of this inefficient housing stock? Or do you think people are becoming more aware of what's coming with regulation, or how do you see it?
They're not necessarily aware, but that's an interesting fact. I think there is, of course, MEPs cannot be taken in isolation. There are lots of regulation applying to the sector as well. And I think at some point, as I say, many of these owners in the private rental sector are individual owners. So, and they're not necessarily very young as well. And they're not necessarily very knowledgeable and able to face, the situation. So for them, it might be easier to sell now, maybe as long as they can, of course, also have a certain value, because of course what you shouldn't forget is, as well, as soon as the MEPs will be in place, you will not be able to rent or sell them. So of course it will diminish the value of a property. So and at the same time, so one thing is the value, the other thing is really they cannot face the challenge. And there again, everyone mentioned, I think this technical assistance is very important. It's of course, I don't necessarily agree with Gyorgy. I think there's a lot of financial elements, and we had a study less than a year ago at UIPI, over 10,000 owners in Europe reply to that, and we see that the financial issue is still the main issue when it comes to renovation in general, not only for the private rental sector. But also a part of it is also this assistance aspect. So providing the tools, helping the owners to do the renovation. And there are more specific also tools for the very, let's say, worst performing stock, and for the poorest, or to help as well the poorest tenants, like a social rental agency scheme, but we can maybe discuss later on. But this is really for a very specific part of the sector.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Well, and you're going to have another chance to speak in a moment, so we'll comment. Maybe you can comment back in a minute. Thank you so much. So we'll now turn to Hélène. Hélène, do you have any examples on how to design some public financing programs to tackle this energy poverty question around, when providing support for these deep renovations? Because I know Ina was mentioning that financing needs to go hand in hand. So what are some good examples of how to design public financing programs?
Yes, indeed. I think Ina was giving the right examples from experience on the ground. And here I would first recall also the benefits of going for deep renovation. I think we cannot really afford, in terms of timing, to wait too long before starting implementing those new measures. So first, because we need to lift those populations that are out of energy poverty, we need to lift them out of it completely. And anything less than deep renovation will maybe just slightly reduce the energy bills, which is good, but is not enough, especially now that we see rising energy prices and the prospect as well of carbon pricing on heating fuels that would start later in this decade. So more specifically on your question, the design on financing programs, I think we have a wide variety of funding sources, whether at EU level or at national level. We can use the ETS revenues, including, but not only, the Social Climate Fund. We could use recovery money. We can use energy efficiency obligation schemes that stem from the EED. And I think the Commission is also giving signals that state aid could be used and granted to fund renovations that are triggered by minimum energy performance standards. But then the question is how to use all that money in the wise way. And I think here 3 points maybe I want to make. The first is to support in priority the most vulnerable, those who cannot really afford to pay anything, and that occupy those worst performing buildings. So that links back to my points on targeting the right buildings and the right people. It should also be used to trigger deep renovation. So linking to my point on really what is the right kind of renovation, the right level of ambition. And here we can design or require member states to design their financing programs in a certain way. For example, ensuring there is a proportion between the financial support, the level of financial support, and the energy performance reached and the depth of renovation. We can, for example, imagine giving bonuses if you do one-step deep renovation, giving bonuses for doing staged deep renovation in just a few number of steps, or when you achieve significant savings in the first steps, or ensuring that you use a building renovation passport, outlining a roadmap, ensuring that you're doing it in the right order. And also using public money to actually set up the ecosystem, or what we call technical assistance, around all the regulations. So, for example, setting one-stop shops or subsidizing building renovation passports as the first step in the renovation roadmap. I think that is really important. As well as focusing on subsidizing renovation works for the most vulnerable. And also to jump back on what Ina and Gyorgy was saying from their own experience from the ground, I think those technical assistance support framework, they be it renovation passports or one-stop shop, they should also be really designed to target those vulnerable households, because we've been seeing that those technical assistance advisory services, often they are picked up by middle and high income groups, but not necessarily by those who need it the most. So there is also work to do on how we design them so that they reach also the right people.
Right, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Maybe, later on you could comment on that if you have any ideas around how do we target. It's a sensitive topic to figure out who actually needs the assistance too. Often those that need it don't know what's out there, so we can address that. But I'll just turn to Gyorgy again then. Can you think of some concrete measures from your practice, your experience, that would be useful to set up, national or local authorities that could, when they're introducing these MEPs, these MEPs with socially just support systems?
Yes, thank you. And just reflecting on Emmanuelle's comment, I absolutely agree that you need financing. I just don't want to downplay that. I just wanted to raise awareness that if you don't convince the homeowners, then it doesn't matter what kind of finance is available. So that I just wanted to make the case that that's this first element, especially in the case of owner-occupied buildings. The truth is that up until now, in my experience, these services, these one-stop shops, are usually the service of NGOs or other mediating organizations who are doing it from donors' money. There are several Horizon projects working on this right now, and these are totally not sustainable because they end when the project funding is ended. And that's why our main argument or message is that there should be public funding spent on these one-stop shops. There are some municipalities who are already doing this, but that's the exception. Especially that municipalities might think that owner-occupied buildings are not their responsibility. And I think the main thing is to capacitate municipalities so they can take this role in a sustainable way, and there should be public funding for it. Public funding to support one-stop shops and giving technical assistance is minimal compared to the cost of a deep renovation. You can't compare the range of, because you need an office and the salary of a couple of people. It's nothing to the cost of the deep renovation of hundreds of buildings. But there should be a public funding line for that to make this sustainable. And when it comes to who to subsidize and how, that's a very tricky question when it comes to owner-occupied buildings, because for the good or bad, these are usually socially mixed communities. So some people are middle class or even upper middle class, and some people are very poor because they got there for all kinds of historic reasons in the same building. So the obvious choice would be to have socially targeted subsidies, so only help the vulnerable consumers in one building. But research showed that it's very difficult to develop and run socially targeted subsidy systems like this. It has very huge transaction costs. So for the central budget, it doesn't necessarily cheaper to run a socially targeted subsidy than a general subsidy, because it costs money to find the poor people, so to speak. And that's why there are other solutions we came across. I think in Lithuania, they try to connect the renovation subsidy to people who are getting other social subsidies. So you don't have to run parallel subsidy schemes, but if you qualify for one social subsidy, then with a good chance you would qualify for the renovation subsidy. The other solution we met from Estonia is that they targeting with the subsidies the certain neighborhoods. It's common knowledge that in certain neighborhoods property has less value, the neighborhoods is poorer. So all the buildings which is located in that neighborhood are eligible for the buildings are eligible, all the homeowners are eligible regardless of their individual income. So there are no one fit for all solutions, but there are emerging solutions. And the last thing I want to say is that we saw in some countries where the subsidy of renovation was very high, in some cases even 100%. And this is totally wrong and distorts the market, because you can't have a sustainable 100% renovation subsidy for many years. So you can run it for half year or a year and then the money is gone. And people don't go for the renovation, but wait for another lottery option like this. And our suggestion is to really go for a lower but long-term sustainable and transparent subsidy scheme, which motivates people to also invest their own money, not to wait for the big subsidy. Thank you.
Great. Okay, that's very clear. And also, you know, the idea, like you're saying, around longevity, these projects that kind of roll over 2 or 3 years. I do understand the EU is starting to have a bit more idea around having longer term programs running, but it's true, just a small amount of funding, public funding to municipalities to run these one-stop shops. It kind of needs to be a permanent structure, or else how is the population going to do anything about it? I know that Padova in Italy has got one of these one-stop shops, if anybody's looking for an example out there. They're doing a great job. Thank you, Gyorgy. And maybe Ina, do you have any comment? Would you like to comment on anything around this idea of, like, how do we really target the most vulnerable in this situation? You know, we can drop money from the sky and all these EU programs, but how do we bring it down to the local and really get the message through to those that are most vulnerable? And that with all these new directives coming through, everybody of course wants to, you know, stop all the carbon emissions but at the same time, we don't, you know, it's more expensive for those who can't renovate and who have old appliances and all the rest of it. And then maybe they just aren't even aware. Do you have anything to say sort of from your perspective on this?
Yeah, well, in first place, we don't have a definition for energy poverty. We have idea of the vulnerable segment of the population, but not exactly the energy poor households or people around. So in first place, we would need to go for some kind of definition on national level, or a specific definition tied to the specific funding scheme for renovation. At the Energy Agency of Plovdiv, we've done investigations how to identify, how to segment such households. And we usually go from the lowest level of criteria. For example, if they have insulation, new windows, new heating equipment, this is for us the minimum that we can say that is a kind of a way to split the population from energy poor, non-energy poor, because energy poor people cannot afford any type of energy renovation service, basically, because it involves investments. We would go first to these families and offer them such services. Then we would see if they can afford to heat themselves properly, if they can afford to pay their bills. This is kind of economic criteria, because usually such people cannot afford to heat or to cool themselves properly and to pay their bills. And finally, we would go for social criteria like multi-family households, lonely retired people with no one else to rely on, people with disabilities who cannot be part of the economically active population and such things. So we would advise our local authorities in our region to segment these households in this way through a set of criteria. In Bulgaria, we do not have a definition, just like in most places in Europe, but we do have a very good policy for the winter supplement program. This is a national program that provides heating and heating fuels for vulnerable households. There are a lot of social criteria in this program, but not economic or energy criteria. And our program offers direct payment for the heating. So they basically pay the bills. And in our opinion, as an energy agency, this is not a good way to go around the issue, because by paying somebody's bill, you help them. Yeah, you ensure that they're warm in winter or cool in summer, but you do not trigger any change in the behavior. You don't make them think about the energy use, the energy consumption, how to improve their energy status, and so on. And at the end of the day, you don't have positive impacts in terms of energy, climate, or environment. We have advised the national bodies a few times to provide incentives that would also support long-term solutions. At the Energy Agency, we are making campaigns, we are donating packages with energy-saving equipment, and so on. And this supports the households in a way that they can save energy for months ahead. It helps them get some knowledge about new energy technologies, about their energy bills and the different features in the energy bill. It raises their awareness and provides some savings, because you change, for example, the lighting, and you thus reduce the energy consumption. It's not just like paying that bill and not producing any energy or something like that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
really
exactly. Okay. That's why I'm making this parallel between what is nationally financed and what we will do as a campaign. If we're talking on national basis, they're just funding their, for example, wood use to heat themselves. But we would say, okay, replace their stove with a better one. This is again funding, but it's targeted to new equipment. It will provide better energy characteristics, better energy performance of the apartment. It will provide heat. It will reduce the use of fuel, and so on. And we need a leverage here, not just paying somebody the bills.
Right, this makes sense. Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm going to just, our last speaker again, if Louise, would you like to take the floor and just, you've sort of seen what everybody's saying here at multiple different levels, but, for the local authorities, what are the benefits then finally? Those local authorities who need to provide all these local measures for implementation, for tackling energy poverty, what's your final word then on the MEPS? Like, what would you add now that you've heard everyone's different perspective?
So if I will, I'll come back to the local authority point in a minute, because I think local authorities and local organisations are absolutely key. But just listening to the really interesting discussion about finance, the one point I haven't heard made that I think is really important is that particularly in the private rented sector, which obviously we're talking about at least in part today. I do think we need to think very carefully about finance mechanisms that allow the sharing of the cost between the tenant, the landlord and the state where necessary fairly. And I think we need to move away from the idea that energy renovations, deep energy renovations, can be paid off through energy bills. I think a lot of our previous private rented sector and finance mechanisms has been based on that, and we've seen the bills go up for tenants. They haven't been able to find those savings. So I think we do need to recognise that these really deep investment intensive renovations can't be entirely paid off through energy bills. There may be some, but this is why I'm talking about this fair sharing of costs. So I think that's just an extra point that we need to make. Then moving on to local authorities, yeah, I mean, when I've looked across these examples across the world, interestingly, the kind of monitoring, the implementation, and actually the enforcement of the standards has been seen really in the hands of the local authority, whether that be a city authority or a state. So I don't think we can underestimate actually the importance of the role of the local authority, both, as I say, in kind of enforcement at the far end, but also in the one-stop shops, in bringing everything together and into making sure that all the enabling mechanisms are there, ensuring that local authorities have the data to figure out, where the underperforming stock is, and to be able to follow up with that, making sure they have the EPC data, making sure they also have the data on which of their citizens are accessing the benefits that might then mean that they get higher levels of finance. All of that stuff sits with the local authority. So in terms of the benefits to the local authority, I think there is a big job for them, and we need to make sure that that is resourced appropriately. So this is something from the experience in the UK. Our standard in the UK for private rented sector is already fully enforced as per the regulation now, but we haven't actually seen a lot of enforcement activity because the local authorities haven't been resourced to do that. And so I think the power of the regulation really sits entirely with the ability for the local authority to enable, to be the holding hand, the guiding light, but also to then enforce where necessary. And there are benefits, I think, from a local planning point of view. That if we put in a minimum performance standards for our buildings, we know what therefore the maximum demand of those buildings will be. It helps us with planning district heating networks. It helps us with planning grid upgrades to the electricity network. I think it is a really important part of the toolkit at local authority level or local level. But as I say, I don't think we can underestimate the resourcing needed to make this work fairly, make it work well. I always say that regulations don't make successful renovations. It is everything else around them. So I think that would be my last point on local authorities, just absolutely key in getting this right.
Thank you. I think that was perfect, kind of seeing all different levels there. And I just want to thank everybody today. We could spend the whole day in a nice conference all together and debate this amongst ourselves and with our audience. But I'd really like to just take a moment to thank everyone, our speakers today, for our ENPOR Lunch Talk. We had several questions coming through in the chat, and I just want the audience to know that we'll be sending these questions to our speakers so that they can answer, and we'll post those answers shortly on the ENPOR website. And so stay tuned for our next lunch talk. These are regular talks that we're doing sort of on a monthly basis, more or less. And be sure to check back on our ENPOR website for more materials that we've been sharing in the chat and from our speakers, and further details from today's talk, which is recorded. So on behalf of myself and our speakers today, thanks everyone for your attention and your chat inputs. And we hope that this lunch talk has offered some valuable insights, and look forward to seeing you again at another ENPOR Lunch Talk. Take care, everybody. Have a great afternoon, and see you soon. Bye now.